welcome everybody. I'm Bhaskar Chakrabarti, Dean of Global Business at the Fletcher School, and I'm here with several colleagues. We'll introduce them in a moment. Let's take just a couple more minutes to make sure that we give a chance to our participants to join, and then we'll get this thing started. We also have some background noise here, so hopefully that's not being picked up by the mic. Okay, why don't we get going? So I'm here at the Murrow Room of the Fletcher School at Tufts University, and I'm joined by my good friend and colleague from the Mastercards Center for Inclusive Growth, Arturo Franco. Arturo, Senior Vice President of Thought Leadership at Mastercard and a collaborator on our Imagining a Digital Economy for All, IDEA 2030 initiative. Arturo, welcome to Fletcher.
It's a pleasure to be here in person and great to see you. Great to see all of our guests.
Fantastic. We would have very much wished to see all of our guests and all our participants here in person, but of course, this is the way that we have been communing for the last 2 years now. And this, in fact, is the subject of our conversation, that so much of our lives have been lived on screens. And what have we learned through this experience? We launched this research initiative as a collaboration between the Fletcher School and the Mastercard Center for Inclusive Growth to better understand the role of technology and how technology, digital technology, is shaping our lives and livelihoods around the world. And we started with the objective of trying to understand how technology is a multiplier in all ways, multiplies access to knowledge, to resources, to communications, to networks, even to payment systems or healthcare and education. But at the same time, we recognize that technology is also finding its way in not so productive ways. And so potentially technology is not just a multiplier, it's also a divider. And so we wanted to get a sense at the start of our project to understand when digital technology is a multiplier and when it is a divider, and how do we as individuals, as policymakers, as entrepreneurs, as social or civic actors, as companies, move the needle in the direction of multiplication rather than division. As soon as we launched this project, pretty much in December 2019 and beginning 2020, suddenly the world changed on us. And the way it changed was, ironically, suddenly we were reliant on technology for everything. We were reliant on technology for meeting with each other. We were reliant on technology for sending our children to school. We were reliant on technology for letting off steam at the end of the day. We were reliant on technology for weddings and funerals. Sadly, a lot of funerals and a lot of goodbyes happened over the screen. This was the launch of the pandemic and the launch of the lockdown, and in many ways, a relaunch of the internet. And at that time, we observed that nobody asked for a pandemic, but since the pandemic was here, this would be the purest test, perhaps the biggest test of the internet since the invention of the internet. Now, looking back at this experience, we have focused our research in a number of different directions, trying to understand how technology has been serving us over the course of the last 2 years. We realized that perhaps it wasn't so much a test of the internet, because the internet mostly held up. Yeah, there were some jittery phone calls, some jittery Zoom calls, and people didn't know how to unmute themselves, or not everybody had access in the same ways, or there were some other difficulties. But mostly the internet held up, despite the fears that many had, including those who were in the technology business. In fact, I was just reading this new book about Facebook, where Facebook were, insiders were very worried that the system would crash when everybody gets on the system at the same time. So the internet more or less held up. But 2 years down the road, we realized that it was perhaps a purer test of us on the internet, or humanity on the internet, and the uneven nature of our connection with the internet, and the implications that holds for all of us. And the unevenness is felt not only across the world, but right here in the United States, where several of us are. So with that, let me turn to you, Arturo, for some observations from you about how you at Mastercard have experienced this transition from, business as usual to a digital planet in your own workings.
Yeah, very happy to go into that and maybe put a little bit of meat or some facts around what you just said. The most massive experiment in the digitization of our lives and our economy. I was telling you the other day that the last 2 years reminded me of this very old video of Arthur C. Clarke, a futurist from back in the 60s, who predicted two things back then. One, the first was the internet. He said by the year 2000 we would be able to communicate with everyone without having to be in a precise physical location. A doctor from London could be operating on a patient somewhere else. And that prediction actually came true even before the year 2000, a decade before he predicted it. But the second big prediction that he made was that because of the internet, we would see the end of proximity, that we would see the death of distance, that cities would cease to exist as kind of centers for work, and that the world would become a giant suburb. That prediction hadn't come true. We were actually seeing more concentration of economic activity in cities, more people kind of living in these mega urban centers. And so I think in my mind, it's this pandemic is kind of like the Arthur C. Clarke moment, right? When the second prediction might or might not become true. So just in 2020, when this massive digital shift started, our own Mastercard data showed that the number of businesses that went online tripled from pre-pandemic levels. E-commerce spending increased by almost $1 trillion during 2020. And it went from, in retail in particular, it went from $1 out of every $5 when it was 1 out of every 7 in 2019. The OECD Digital Economy Outlook, to the point you made about the internet, recorded in some countries internet traffic increasing by up to 60% in 2020. And I wouldn't be surprised if folks here around the room or our panelists or people listening to us would not have subscribed to a new online service during the year. I think it's pretty much 100% of us subscribe to something new that happens online. And so 2020 was a year of many firsts. You mentioned education, schooling, online conferences, telehealth, all of these new things. But 2021 was the year where we were wondering how much of that would stick. And our early data on, at least on the small business e-commerce trend, is that at least 20 to 30% of that will stay. The question is how much of the remote work will stay, how much of the online conferences will stay, how much of the online schooling will it be an option forever going forward. And I think that that's why we are here, and it's such an interesting panel, because we're going to touch on the question about how in this accelerated digital future we need to make sure that we have both inclusion and resilience, right? And so we're going to talk about the effective governance of data, a better digital infrastructure, particularly around health and education, and for those who are underserved, and really ensuring that everyone, the parents, the workers, the teachers, have the skills that they need to succeed in the digital economy. So really looking forward to this conversation. Thank you for having me.
Great, fantastic. So thank you for your observations, Arturo. And it's fascinating to hear about the data that you're picking up at Mastercard alone, and it's in many ways a barometer of the change, the kind of rapid change that we experienced in the early stages of 2020. And now as we transition from 2021 to 2022, I think across the world, we are asking the question, how are we going to go back? We certainly are not going to go back to where we were in 2019. So the needle is going to be somewhere in between business as usual, face to face versus on screen. And that hybrid existence is a very difficult place to be. And no one quite knows how to navigate that. And even that needle is going to constantly keep moving as we have, fresh uncertainties coming around the corner. Right now, we're living through uncertainties relating to a new variant that we still don't fully understand. So with that, let me provide a little bit of introduction to the research and some of the insights that we have been developing with our research partners around the world. So obviously trying to cover the surface area of the planet, of the pandemic planet, and trying to get a sense of how it has transitioned into a digital planet and what kinds of patterns are coming through as we try to understand the data from that digital planet is a huge task. That is an enormous amount of surface area to cover. And we have a fantastic team here at the Fletcher School investigating these issues, but no matter how fantastic this team is, we certainly can't cover all the issues that are popping up. So we reached out to some of the best people around the world who have insights into specific areas of the human condition on the digital planet. And we assembled this network of researchers working alongside us. So let's take the next half hour or so learning about what they're learning and what they have learned over the course of the last 2 years regarding our existence on the digital planet. And to kick us off, I have two good friends, Rukmini Banerjee and Willima Wadhwa. Rukmini is the CEO of Pratham, the preeminent education NGO in the world. It's based out of India, but it's the preeminent NGO, not just in India, but in the world. And Willima is the director of the Usher Center. And Usher is a study that Pratham leads every year. And it is widely regarded as the gold standard for impact evaluation of education interventions anywhere in the world. And this past year, in 2020, when we collaborated with Usher, was an unusual Usher study where we were trying to understand how children were learning digitally because all the schools were closed. So let me turn this over to Rukmini and Willima to share a bit about your objectives of the work that you did in 2020 and what you learned from it, and what did you find surprising from your research?
Thank you, Bhaskar, and thank you for having us here today. As you know, we've been doing ASER, which is the Annual Status of Education Report, since 2005. This is a survey of learning and schooling done every year, and with a sample of about 600,000 children. We did it for 10 years, from 2005 to 14, and then we started a new cycle in 16 where we do the big foundational ASER, testing basic numeracy and literacy every other year. And so 2020 was the year for us to go to all 600 districts of India. But as you know, by March, India and the rest of the world had shut down, and it became quite clear to us that it would not be possible to go into the field this year. And especially not with volunteers, because ASER is done across the country by about 25,000 volunteers who volunteer every year with us. So, so the thing was that what should we do? Maybe we should not do a survey this year, but at some level, it was even more important to do a survey last year. First, while it was known that the pandemic would affect learning outcomes adversely, with budgets being squeezed, it was also possible that more children would drop out. Second, given the way schools shut down and are still kind of reopening, primary classes have still not opened in some states in India. It was also clear that the effect would be on different aspects of of education at different times. And finally, and most importantly, the pandemic had affected already disadvantaged and vulnerable groups far more. And it was possible that that was the case in education as well. So we pivoted really fast, and ASA 2020 was conducted as a phone survey across the country, covering about 584 districts across about 30 states and union territories. And the focus, we didn't want to test children on the phone. So the focus of the survey was access to learning materials during the period when schools were closed. So the survey was conducted in September of last year, and it focused basically on four areas: enrollment, support that children had in learning at home, and their access to learning materials which states and schools were sending, and their engagement with learning materials. Some very interesting findings, but I am going to confine myself to a few here. One of the things that we saw was that there was a big jump in smartphone penetration in rural India. So in 2018, only about just under 32% households had a smartphone, and in 2020 this number was around 62%. However, having a smartphone doesn't necessarily mean that the child has access to it. In fact, we've done ASAR this year as well, also on the phone, and we added a question this year asking that if there is a smartphone at home, does the child have access to it to study? And what we found was that 1/4 of the children in homes that had a smartphone actually don't have access to the device. Similarly, there were a lot of equity issues. There've always been equity issues, but the remote learning it opens up yet another channel. And so what we found was that we looked at equity from various angles, and one of the dimensions that we looked at children with low parental education as compared to children with high parental education. And what we found was that there were huge differences in access to smartphones, in the amount of help they were getting from family members to study at home, and similarly in terms of access to learning materials. So the state was extremely successful in getting textbooks out. 80% children had the textbook of their current grade, but not so much in getting other materials out. So only about 35% said that they had received some learning material from their schools. And if we looked at children with low parental education, this number was way lower, and which is understandable because in most cases, the learning material was sent using WhatsApp, and if you don't have a smartphone, then you're not going to get the learning material. And this was again then reflected in the amount of learning engagement that they could do, activities that they could engage with in terms of learning at home. And so while about 70% children said overall that they did some kind of learning activity in the previous week, only about 60% children with low parental education said that they had done any learning activity, and which again, if you don't get any learning materials, then you're not going to be able to engage with learning at home. So, these were some of the main findings that we had from the survey. And so, like Bhaskar, you said in the beginning, technology can be a great enabler, but it can be a great divider as well. And we need to figure out what we want it to be. So, planning for suddenly technology in education, and everybody's talking about model, and so planning ahead in terms of what worked and for whom and how. And at this point, Pratham, we did a lot of programs, and there are a lot of learnings during this period. And I will hand over to Rukmini at this point to tell us a little bit about some of the things, some of the programs that we ran during this period.
Thank you, Wilima. I think we are probably done with our allotted time. So perhaps I should just wait, and maybe when we have a conversation, I can jump in. Bhaskar? You're on mute, Bhaskar.
Yeah. Rukmini, just go ahead and do share with us about how this has influenced your vision for Pratham going forward, and then we'll go to the other questions.
So I'll be very brief. I think the synergy between the research we do and the practice we do on the ground is quite closely linked. So I just want to highlight a couple of things. We learned quite early on, both from the data as well as from our experience, that smartphones, lots of Indians have smartphones, and it's increasing, but we still have a large number of families, depending on the state, where they have basic phones. So we developed very quickly, messaging on basic phones, and learned a great deal about what you can pack into 160 characters. The characters differ a little bit from language to language, but what can you put in this very little bit that you can send that can first engage kids, and actually more importantly, engage families to do some activities with kids. I don't want to take up time in giving you examples of things we learned, but I think that was one big one. A second big one was we weren't concerned initially with learning. We wanted to engage. We wanted families to participate, because in the first 3 months, 4 months of the lockdown, all you could do was really have family help. And both from the study as well as from our experience, we saw that even in low educated families, there were siblings, there were parents, everybody was trying to help. So the question was, what can you give them that can actually engage kids? And we've learned a great deal on what, the way I put it is that Pratham is well known for having evolved a instructional methodology called teaching at the right level. But during the pandemic, in many ways, we learned how to reaching at the right level. Who do you reach to do what? And especially, what do you do with an SMS in a low education family? How do you connect parents who so far have been included in schooling of children, but not necessarily in learning? Lots of learnings there. Second thing, I think, is that we developed a two-way communication, partly because we had no idea if all these things that you're sending is even getting there. So at the peak of the school closures, we were sending out anywhere between 200,000 to 300,000 messages a day. But we didn't do this in bulk. SMS bulk messaging could have been done, because we wanted the personal connect that the Pratham team members have to their communities. And so every family got a phone call from somebody they knew before the pandemic, either once a week or at least once every fortnight, to find out how they were, how the kids were, how the family was, and what were they doing with this little bit that came. And that two-way communication was fantastic, because very often kids would call you back from different kinds of numbers. Once they wanted to communicate, they would find a way to do it. And even tracking and mapping that was difficult. And the third thing is that especially places where resources were low, we formed, and as the lockdown became, it loosened up, we formed little groups of children with a volunteer or a youth member we tried in every hamlet. We worked directly in about 10,000 villages. And so think about this as 40 or 50,000 little neighborhoods. And we found that the combination of the social structure with the device and then the content, these three needed to be iterated and worked with, and feedback kept coming in. And my hope is that and again, I'm not saying that this had a massive effect on learning, but I think we've learned a lot about how to connect people on the issue of learning, especially people who were otherwise not connected to their own children's, what they did in school. So our hope is that, and of course, we shared this all along as we went along. One last bit I want to say: when the second wave hit India, these networks that we had set up were very helpful, because we took about 6 weeks, stopped doing any educational work, and really spread messages about COVID and about prevention and about vaccination and things like that. We had a quiz at the end of this, a COVID quiz, but a lot of people laughed at us. We had 1 million people who signed on to the quiz, families, parents, grandparents, children. So this social network that was established even with very low resources, I think was a huge plus point. And now the question is, what do you do with all of this as schools begin to open? And time will tell, but we hope that the learnings from this will not be lost, because we have learned how to connect and how to remain connected with especially with low income, low educated parents on the issue of learning.
Fantastic. This is an incredible development, of course, Rukmini. Your emphasis on reaching on top of teaching is an important takeaway from this experience, and I think it gives us a perfect segue to Robin from Dahlberg. So Robin Miller is a partner at Dahlberg and usually based out of South Africa. You may actually be in New York right now, I think. So Robin, you can correct me regarding your geographic location. But the work that you've been doing and your team has been doing in terms of thinking about digital acceleration in a different part of the world, but in many ways, many of the characteristics and attributes of society there and people there and the condition that they have to work with are quite similar to the environment that Rukmini and William are talking about. So Robin, can you share a bit about the work that you've been doing on digital accelerators out of Africa and some of the developments there over the last couple of years?
Absolutely, and thank you, Bhaskar, Arturo, and colleagues. Really a pleasure to be connecting with all of you on the interesting work you're doing. And even as I was going through the introductions, already starting to connect dots between and across our projects. So similar contexts, as Bhaskar was just saying, as we look from India to sub-Saharan Africa, and so much to learn in both directions, and things to grow. So thank you, Bhaskar, and I was really excited when we first started talking about the opportunity to work together. From where I sit, I've spent the past decade and a half focused on what was then not called digital transformation, but the construct of how digital technologies, both as an infrastructure as well as a source of innovation and a source of skills, et cetera, can unlock economic growth, and in particular, inclusive economic growth. My work and our work, particularly over the past 4 or 5 years, has moved from inclusive of thinking about the opportunities to advance national development agendas, and as countries are setting high bars, tackling persistent challenges ranging from how do you bolster agricultural growth, how do you increase access to healthcare, how do you address inclusive access to education. These are complex challenges, and increasingly, I think, universally seen as digital being and digital transformation being a way to drive more inclusion. Now, of course, the complexity of that lies in how. And so for many years, we've been working with national governments, we've been working with large technology companies and industry players, and we've been working with philanthropists, venture capital, other types of financiers, asking, what is it that can be done to accelerate digital transformation towards any particular objective, and whether that's a national development agenda or it's something more specific in a particular industry or sector? How do we really unlock that growth? And so what was exciting about this piece of research and where we're focusing is 2 elements. One is taking the construct of digital transformation and first applying it to one of many issues, but an issue that's almost on probably most government agendas in particular was exacerbated through COVID, which is a question of thinking about employment and the opportunities for current skilling and growth of economies through the lens of either upskilling, reskilling, or ensuring that enough employment opportunities exist in the region. And we wanted to ask ourselves, building on the work that we've done, how can we move from early examples of what kinds of investments are needed to solutions that are sustainable and effective at a higher scale? So in order to do this, we did a couple things. The first was we looked at the question of what do we mean by digital transformation? And the second was we asked ourselves, how do we see the role of technology and digital influencing, let's call it the future of work, but we could also call it education to employment if we want to take a slightly different lens. In the first instance, our work with digital transformation has really started to both reflect on work we've been doing with governments, investors, and other philanthropic partners as well over the past few years, and recognizing that the framework in and of for what kinds of components are necessary to truly leverage digital technologies to support inclusive growth is a complex set of investments and set of frameworks. I'm sure that many of you listening and on this conversation have seen different frameworks. The way we've been thinking about it is if you can almost envision a pyramid. At the base layer, you have the hard infrastructure. So the connectivity, the network infrastructure, the access to devices, the cost of data. At the top, you might have a smaller piece of the pyramid, which is the innovative applications and services that people are using. In between, you have something that we've been focusing a lot of our time on, which we refer to as enabling infrastructure, but it's really the things that help to unlock return on investment for infrastructure or help to build and grow markets for those applications and services that are starting to take off. And that middle layer includes sort of three basic things. One that gets you to the questions of who are you interacting with, what are you transacting or exchanging in this virtual world, and how are you doing so? And what I mean by that in more simple terms is things like identity systems, consideration for things like asset registries, so you also know what goods or services are physically moving, where ownership might lie. Some of the elements of data to understand what information and what underlies each of those two components. And the question of how, so digital payments, for example, how do you actually exchange goods and services? And it gets us into the space of commerce, where we're looking at addressing systems to know where things are moving, et cetera. What we've seen about this layer that was particularly interesting as we started our work was that it's the space where the platforms, the infrastructure in and of itself is a difficult thing to justify in terms of investment, because the return on those investments sits in so many different places that value is derived in many different places, yet critically important. So in the first instance, we're starting to see greater investment in that enabling layer that also goes alongside investments in infrastructure, investments in innovation ecosystems, as well as policy and getting capital and the right kinds of skills in place. So wanting to hone in on that kind of layer, we then asked ourselves, well, we're really trying to, in building on our work, focus on the question of how to unlock opportunities for youth, unlock access to employment, and live through what I think has been the impact of COVID in many ways, accelerating opportunities for innovation, but at the same time, exacerbating or showing some of the cracks in the system when it comes to the resilience of labor markets. So in the second side, we considered then, how do we think about digital infrastructure, digital transformation towards an end goal of employment? And within that as well, how do we think about the skills that are needed? How do we think about the infrastructure needed, and the support systems in place to help businesses grow and industries grow? Our models, as we got to the question then of interesting models for acceleration, we asked ourselves 4 questions. So one is, what are the types of investments we're seeing? And I've belabored that in my description of these enabling layers and how we begin to link those into the question of employment infrastructure and labor market resilience. Second was the sequencing. So looking, is it that, what can we learn from countries? Does one investment follow the next? Are these things where a cluster of investments at one moment in time spark innovation and there's a flywheel effect that takes place? Or is there something about the complementarity of specific types of capital, certain amounts of time? And then the third question we began to ask is the specific structures. And this was particularly interesting for us because we've seen many pilots, things working on a small scale, but the structures coming together to make sure that short-term investments are leading to longer-term outcomes, and also that things happening on a smaller scale are growing. I realize I'm getting close to time or already over, but I'll just highlight 3 examples that have been interesting to us. And as you mentioned, we're still in the midst of the work that we're doing, but there were 3 elements that stood out, 3 types of investment we've been looking at, and then 3 things that came out of it in terms of learnings. The first is we've spent a lot of time looking at labor market information systems. A recognition that as you start to talk about the question of employment, one of the biggest challenges many governments are facing is they fundamentally don't know what skills are in their economies and or what jobs are in their economies and how to most effectively match. So it's brought us in some work we've done with a few East African governments in particular, this question of how to use digital and data to better understand what talent you have existing within your country, what opportunities are starting to emerge, and how to most effectively bring those things together. That included collecting better data, including aggregating data more effectively. It included bringing that information to the fingertips of decision makers at the right moment in time. And once those even systems are built, the capacity to use that information across many ministries, across the public and private sector, across the training organizations that are doing the work, the education systems as well, the change management that goes along with thinking differently about the role and use of data. A second one I'll mention briefly we're quite interested in is looking at digital public infrastructure specifically for the purposes of accessing education. Here we actually have been in discussions with some colleagues in India as well about some exciting examples that have achieved scale, but thinking about the role that digital infrastructure plays and some of the opportunities that we've started to see, but also limitations when it comes to funding and financing. And the last one is different kinds of investment in connectivity, because as we've seen in COVID, one of the things that has become very clear was that the digital divide is still quite real from an access to connectivity perspective. At the same time, technology costs are going down, but for some reason, we're not moving as quickly to get people connected as I think most stakeholders argue we would like to see. So last comment I'll make, but which is there were three very specific examples that we're looking at now, and then across them we've started to see the interplay of three maybe common features of what we think is starting to form accelerator models that can really bring these solutions to more locations and start to increase the ultimate outcomes that we want. Capital will be no surprise. The kind of capital, the access to capital, the cost of capital, a highly complex space, and something that we're seeing a number of challenges also being addressed, but where we're seeing some interesting insight. Second being capacity, and I think I mentioned a bit earlier, not just the skills in place, but also what does it take to really change behavior over an entire group of decision makers, group of users, and thinking more holistically about the role of capacity. And the final one I'll mention is just like the connective tissue between investments. We see increasingly a conversation that says we recognize many investments are needed in different places to make something happen. But when it comes to the connective tissue that either is supporting the links between those investments, that is managing the risk between, or is bringing those different investments together in a way that realizes that there's value happening in many different ways. This connective tissue is space in terms of both capacity and governance is one that we're seeing as a highlight. I do apologize to my colleagues. I know I've gone a few minutes over, but let me pause there, and I look forward to the conversation.
Great, thank you, Robin. Thank you for the tremendous overview of the different accelerators that you've been investigating across many different countries in the continent. I think there's a lot of connectivity across the insights that Rukmini and Willem were talking about, from their experiences in India, and some of the accelerators as they relate to skill building and job creation in sub-Saharan Africa that we'll hopefully get some time to dig into. But as we reflect on some of these changes that are happening on the ground, this gives us an opportunity to step back a little bit and look at a larger picture of what has been evolving around the world, starting in pretty much close of 2019 and beginning of 2020, as governments around the world were taking some fairly draconian steps in terms of locking their citizens in, as they realized that this was a really serious, once in a lifetime, once in a generation event that was affecting us all. And nobody quite understood the nature of the virus. We were beginning to share data about its genetic code, and people were just beginning to decipher how contagious the virus could be. And of course, we were learning very, very rapidly as to how dangerous this virus is going to be. So governments around the world were taking steps to limit civil liberties, get people to stay at home, lock down entire societies. And we can all remember pictures from cities around the world that were completely deserted, whether it was Johannesburg or New Delhi or New York. And as particularly democratic governments were taking these undemocratic steps, a natural question to ask was how well positioned were these governments to understand how their citizens were responding to this kind of a lockdown. So we turned to Oret Van Heerden and his team to try and understand how to gauge citizen response to a top-down crackdown, as it were, by governments. And in a way, this would also provide us some pattern recognition in terms of how to make policy interventions interact with citizen response. And Oret and his team have an innovative way to try and get behind that question. So over to you, Oret, to share a bit about the work that you have done. And Oret is the founder of Equisection. Oret, maybe you can say a little bit about what Equisection does and the technology that you've deployed to try and understand inclusive policymaking.
Thank you, Bhaskar. So what we do is monitor human rights in global value chains. And very often these are value chains providing goods to your favorite brand name companies, right? So when the initial news of the epidemic started to come out of Wuhan, we wanted to appreciate the impact that it was having. And we realized that we couldn't rely on conventional media or government statements. So I immediately set up a team in China, including in Wuhan, and we started to track posts in the public domain, public posts on the most popular social media sites in China. And it gave us this incredible insight into the way people were experiencing the impact of this emerging pandemic. And we could see, for example, we could track Foxconn factory sites where they were returning from their Spring Festival holiday and they should have been starting to make iPhones and iPads again. And Apple and Foxconn were making statements about when they would start up. But we could see from the testimony of workers that there was no way they were going to start up, that the situation on the ground, on the factory floor, as it were, was completely different to the picture that was being conveyed through public statements. So we realized we needed to really track this because there's a disconnect between what governments and companies were saying and what people were experiencing in real life. So we realized we needed to go to scale, and we started to plug into all of the data sources that we could, and we bootstrapped some scraping tools and started to collect information. And it grew to a point where we started to use some very powerful tools, and we decided to track the experience across 8 different countries. We took from New Zealand and South Korea and Singapore, India, South Africa, through to the UK and the USA. And over a 7-month period, we looked at what people were posting and we contextualized that. We looked at what governments were doing, what other major events might have been occurring in those societies. And we were able to interpret what people were saying by adding this additional context. And we would then use some narrative techniques, analytical techniques, to track that story over time. With these tools, these natural language processing tools, you can obviously analyze sentiment, positive and negative. You can analyze the emotions. And if you bring in human analysts, you can then start to really put the story together. And so very briefly, let me just tell you what we found. Interestingly enough, although the initial decisions to lock down or to somehow restrict activity to counter the virus were pretty draconian in most countries and were often introduced with the language of war. There was an initial rallying to the flag. People were very relieved that the government was doing something. They generally supported the government. And in most of the countries, we saw this rally to the flag effect, except notably in the USA, where the positive and negative reactions were almost always just about equal. Any action which was taken had a tremendous polarizing effect. And we saw that the emotions, whereas in most countries we'd have a positive emotional reaction to the decision to lock down, in the US we had positive and negative. We had joy and sadness, anger and disgust, all rising at pretty much the same rate. So a very, very polarized response, very different to what you saw in New Zealand and South Korea and Singapore and so on. However, that initial support, that rally to the flag, starts to decline over time. And we could see what governments did in order to gain, maintain, and restore trust as that support started to wane. New Zealand was, of course, very effective in this regard. The Prime Minister would have a lot of personal communication, direct communication, Facebook Live on a Sunday night from her living room. And she was able to sustain that trust much more effectively. But in most of the other countries, we noticed that a phenomenon we've called blind spots kicked in, where the governments had frankly just ignored the lived experience of large sectors of the population. In Singapore, this was migrant workers. In South Korea, it was gig economy workers. In other countries, it might have been churches, informal sector workers, people living in informal settlements. And these blind spots were frankly inexcusable, because if the governments had been using a tool like ours to monitor the lived experience of people, they would have picked it up very quickly. And you could use this tool, this sort of large-scale sentiment and emotion analysis, at every stage in the policy cycle, from agenda setting through policy formulation, implementation, monitoring, and ultimately evaluation. So let me try and stop there within my time limit, and I look forward to discussing the uses you could put this tool to later on with the rest of the participants.
Fantastic. As you're talking, another point of connection that I would make is, and I don't want to complicate this anymore for Willema and her project, but you do USSR at the end of the year. I'm wondering whether there's a way to do a real-time, dynamic response over the course of social media analysis, as different kinds of educational interventions, make their way into the lives of children, families, the communities. So there could be some cross-fertilization of your tools, with the work that Willema and her team does. In any case, this is, of course, enormously fascinating, and each one of your activities, whether it is capturing social media responses by people who are being subjected to draconian policy interventions, or educational interventions which are not draconian, or other kinds of interventions which are meant to accelerate employment and job creation. Every single one of these actions, if they're done over a technological platform, is generating data. And Robin, you mentioned this notion of data and who, where is it going, and who collects it, and how is it being used, particularly in many parts of the world where citizens don't entirely trust the government to be stewards or responsible stewards of the data. Citizens across the world don't necessarily trust companies either. So what is the state of data governance and the privacy and other forms of protection of ordinary users as they continue to generate data simply by the fact that they have a phone, simply by the fact that 62% of Indians now have smartphones, as Rukmini and Willema observed? What are the implications of data protection and across not just India and other parts of the world. So Susan and Thomas, you've done an incredible study of data governance principles across 52 countries. Perhaps you can share some insights from your research.
Great. Thank you so much, Bhaskar, and nice to meet everybody in the audience and here. So we sought to define what data governance looks like, a picture of data governance, and in particular, a holistic and comprehensive approach to data governance at the national and international levels. I'll let my colleague Thomas take it from here.
Yeah, so I guess I'll share my screen. Just two little visuals. I'll keep it short, but just wanted to kind of emphasize 2 points about, we wanted to create basically, I think I'm sharing now, there we go, a metric that would show kind of like how data governance is in a country. And something we really wanted to focus on was more of this systemic approach and this holistic, comprehensive approach to data governance. So traditionally, when people are talking about data governance, they're talking about laws, data protection laws, things like that. But one thing we wanted to do was just look at other aspects of that. So looking at structural aspects, how a government might change to deal with data governance, how they participatory aspects of it. So looking at how they bring in other stakeholders, how they bring in citizens into the process, and also strategic aspects. So how does the government kind of talk about the future of data governance, as well as ethical responsibilities that they put forward, and international. So not just data governance at the domestic level, but also how are they working both with binding acts and also more like soft norm spreading acts at the international level. So that was really something that we wanted to capture with this metric. And then another thing that I just want to kind of present about this is that we weren't just trying to compare nations and see who's doing more data governance, who's not, who's doing less data governance, but something we really wanted to kind of look at is within a country, where are they focusing resources and where are they actually doing governance at? So kind of just 4 of the countries we had here out of the 52, we kind of can see how countries like the UK kind of had a more well-rounded approach looking, dealing with multiple different aspects, while countries like Brazil seem to put a lot more work towards the regulatory side, participatory side, and international, or sorry, I can't, my screen is blocking, the structural side of data governance, and then doing less in other areas. So just wanted to kind of share that just to show kind of how our metric kind of sought to understand data governance. And that was a big purpose of it, was to kind of put forward a way of thinking about data governance. Thank you.
And then just to finish, the key takeaways we have is that we're not simply defining data governance as laws and regulations, but increasingly it includes visions and strategies, ethical and human rights consideration, how they change government. The structure of government is changing to accommodate data. And we can talk about what we mean by that in the questions. And our metric is just simply a snapshot of what nations are doing in time, but we find every day something changes. If we are to summarize the metric, we see nations are doing more to regulate and adapt governance structures than to develop participatory, and this kind of builds on Aurette's point, responsible and internationally shared approaches. And that is scary. So with that, we'll be short.
Well, thank you, Thomas and Susan, for a very, very crisp overview of a very comprehensive piece of research that the two of you have done. Susan and Thomas are with the Data Governance Hub at the Elliott School at George Washington University, where Susan directs the center. So thank you so much for sharing your insights, and thank you to all of our participants. Let me turn to Arturo. See, any initial observations from what you've heard across these different teams and questions that you might have for our participants?
Yeah, very happy to do so. I think the data and the ideas that we've seen here today are fascinating in many ways. First, because as we spoke about at the very beginning, when we started this partnership idea 2030, we never imagined that we were just going into the biggest digital experiment in history where every country had to deal with the same things, right? And so seeing the changes from the top down of how government had to accelerate their management of the data economy because it just happened overnight, and where you see these kinds of rates of smartphone penetration, 30% in 2 years. In a country like India, it's a crazy number. Like, we would have never predicted this 3 years ago. I was reading last week that in my country, Mexico, 15 million people last year made their first digital payment. That's about 30% of the adult population of the country having their first digital payment experience in the same year. And the list goes on and on. In the US, the appointments of a telehealth consultation was 78 times in April 2020 what it was in February 2020. So we went into this kind of crazy acceleration of all things digital. And I think that the things that I rescue from the panel is perhaps what we lost in learning and education, to Rukmini's point, we gained in digital literacy. And so I guess my question to the Pratham team, and I think there was something on the report about this, was other than engagement and reach, was there any kind of literacy on the digital side that you helped families with, and what would be your take on the acceleration of digital literacy? And if I can just then add another point to this, another question, I think that this idea of this trust bubble that was built at the beginning of the pandemic with government, I mean, government went from very low rates of trust in all of the measures to very high trust at the very beginning of the pandemic.
Depends on which government.
Most in the world, because they seem to be the adults in the house, at least in March and April and May, and then disappointment set in. I'm wondering if there is any way, and then perhaps this is a question for the panel, that we think that as we come out of the pandemic, that we will recover our trust in institutions in the short term. But maybe let's start with Pratham on the question about did you see any digital literacy happen during the last year?
And before Rukmini, you respond, we can just want to make sure for our wider audience, we'll just put a link in the chat for all the reports that have been published so that you can go to the original studies as well. Back to you, Rukmini.
Yeah, so I would say that we had to become digital. So I'll within Pratham, I mean, starting from this reaching out through phones, the first strategy was, we never used phones really because we were meeting kids face to face all the time. And so when it suddenly stopped, let's say we were, as I said, in about 10,000 villages, we first had to find at least one number in every village. Then we said, can you give us at least one contact in every hamlet? And then when you got a number in the hamlet, then you try to maximize the number of numbers you had. So even very simple thing like setting up your own little, whatever you may call it, directory. But then, you could see that, for whether it was us as an organization or the government with the teachers, if the only way that you could connect was through these remote means, then people started, developing. I mean, we were no different from other people. What kind of message? What do you give? And I think the other thing, which I hope somebody will study, is that from a very centralized, very structured curriculum that is delivered in a linear way in only one method, at least, anywhere where there were good teachers, people started reaching out in their own ways and developing potentially things that you thought your kids would like. Now, how do you get a measure of that is very hard to do. But I know that at least some state governments in India have tried to now harness all the different things that their teachers made and sent out to see what is the, what are criteria on which you can judge this content stuff that has gone out. So a lot of, I would say, local development of stuff. I'm calling it stuff because I don't think content is a big word as well. On our side, we could see that, we have a full-time team in Pratham and Asar of about 7,000 people. Everybody had to pick up, all these skills very quickly, including, how do you talk on Zoom? What do you do when the phone is not yours? How do you persuade other people to allow you to use their phone for 15 minutes a day and so on? And we've come up with actually small modules of digital readiness that can be delivered on WhatsApp. And that's partly because if we were able to establish the contact with, whoever in the community, then we could, start building a whole, engagement and learning path on that. So just to finish, in the period August, September, October of this year, when we knew schools are now beginning to reopen, but kids need to be helped, kind of to bridge the distance to school, we tried to set up small children's groups, 6, 7, 8 kids with one youth volunteer. And the deal was, we call it education for education. If you give time to kids in your community, can we do something for you? So what we did for them was a little digital readiness course, just how to upload things on a portal, how to register, stuff that you need to do now. And we had close to 30,000 volunteers who taught kids, but also got this, sort of step one for your digital readiness. And so as a long run strategy, we now see the need to establish these anchors in every community. So we did this with youth. We are now doing it with mothers, because this year, the kids who are in 1st and 2nd grade have never been to school. They've never had preschool either. So we have little mothers groups for the 1st and 2nd grade kids. And we say that the anchor for that group is somebody called Smart Mom. And she's smart. All moms are smart, but she's called Smart Mom because she has a smartphone. And we hope that we can hang on to this and grow it as we go along. So that's what we did. But I think everywhere, anybody with education did stuff like this. And I don't think we are doing enough to analyze what worked and what didn't and what did you learn. It may not have worked, but what did you learn, I think, is really important.
Great. I would have, I don't know if Robin is still with us, but I think I would have a similar question moving from education to the world of skilling in this enabling layer that you talked about. I think, look, in many, I love what you said about the internet didn't fail. In many of these aspects of life and work and skilling and employment, the technology was already there. It was there 5 years ago. It was there 2 years ago. What was missing was this kind of coordination, right? There was a coordination failure where we were still living in the real life world. And even if it's more productive for me to take 10 Zoom calls in a day without a commute to the office than to have 5 meetings in person, there was a coordination failure. My other colleagues were not going to be online, so it felt awkward for me to stay home in my pajamas, etc. Right? Once you are forced to change into the other equilibrium where everyone is online, I think that you start seeing all of the benefits of not having to go to see the doctor in person. As good as that feels, and you get a candy at the end, it is more efficient for the doctor, and probably safer for you to be there online because the technology exists. So I think in Robin's world, was there in this layer that you said was critical for this acceleration, any specific example of what worked really well in getting more workers or people to skill up massively, or connecting supply and demand of employment in Africa?
Yeah, thanks, Arturo. Great question. To be honest, there were a number of examples that come to mind in different ways. So one, when I think about skilling, I think about both the direct skills gained and gleaned from an educational standpoint. And obviously, I heard a lot about schools being closed, but then the investments in online learning, the zero rating of different access that was coming through from, in some cases, telecommunications companies, in other cases, tech companies, in other cases, education universities. You saw an immediate kind of proliferation of trying to push through content. Another lens that I saw from a skilling perspective is a slightly different spin to students, but thinking about small business and both it links a little bit to your digital literacy question just a moment ago. Some of the spaces where I've seen what I think are some of the strongest literacy programs are when solutions meet the needs of the individuals using them. There's been the arguments in the past that M-Pesa was the best digital literacy solution that Kenya had seen. And so when I think about some of the skills sort of gleaned through COVID, I think both the way in which governments responded to distribute funds and financing for small business that we're trying to navigate through the space. So whether it's survival funds, it was called Survival Fund, I think in Nigeria, and their COVID relief funds elsewhere, Solidarity Fund in South Africa, and others. It's sort of like an underlying layer of skill, but just the notion of all of a sudden accessing services from government or accessing financing, the kind of skills of engagement with those platforms and those systems. It was definitely something that bolstered. One other example related to that we saw was a bolstering of engagement with identity systems, for example, in Nigeria and other places. And maybe one final just thought in terms of skill is, I think with the governments that I've worked on and worked with, but in particular few in East and West Africa, I've seen a real leaning in to figure out not only how to bring the technical skills that are needed, but also almost the translating skills that are needed to communicate. Here's the technical solutions we have, but now how do we make this usable and meaningful? So I saw acceleration in terms of governance skills of accessing and using data in a different way. Yeah, pause there.
Great, thank you, Robin, for that, and thank you for some great questions, Arturo. I'm wondering, David Porteous, as you listen to this discussion, you're in the process of envisioning how we can prepare a coming generation of digital leaders, whether they are in government or in companies or even in the social sector, as they think about the use of technology and the deployment of technology in inclusive ways. And you're hearing these perspectives that are from the ground up and then from the top down. How does this influence your own thinking about a learning agenda? And share a little bit about what you have in mind and what you're envisioning in terms of a learning agenda.
Oscar, thank you, and good morning, good afternoon to all of you. It's a pleasure to be listening in on this conversation. And as you said, Bhaskar, listening in from the perspective of working as a Fletcher partner, as Digital Frontiers has done for a number of years now, in co-certifying online courses that have been widely taken across the developing world in areas like digital finance. And now the question is digital economy. And so, Bhaskar, to answer your question, I've been listening a bit like somewhat a combination between a movie director who's listening for what are those takes that really stand out, that belong in a new course that's thinking about leading inclusive digital economies, which is the focus of this proposed course, drawing on this treasure trove of Digital Planet and Ideas 2030 data. So I'm a little bit like that movie director, listening for those vivid shots, takes that are possible. And I feel a bit like, frankly, a fruit tester, which is testing for how ripe this fruit is, because one of the challenges in a course is the fruit has to be ripe enough that one can take it to a wide audience. In other words, it's robust enough to stand as learning that is worth exporting on a large scale. And I think, Bhaskar, my answer would be that I've heard a lot this morning from different perspectives, which I think can contribute a lot to the answer of this key question: what makes a leading inclusive digital economy, which is really the theme of this proposed course. Let me summarize 4 quick things that I've heard that I would certainly like to see coming through in the learning outcomes for the course. The first is, I think we've heard very clearly that it's not just about the hard infrastructure in a country. We've heard that from Pratham's work. It's possible to do that even with not necessarily the fanciest of technology in India in education. We heard it in Robin's discussion about that enabling infrastructure layer, which is so critical to some of the outcomes that sits on top of the hard infrastructure. And that doesn't relieve countries of thinking of the hard infrastructure, but as we engage with policymakers, so often they get stuck on that and don't think enough about the factors beyond and what can be done around them. The second is, I've heard that it's possible for leading inclusive digital economies to employ new measurement tools. And specifically, I've been hearing of two here. The one is Oret's type of sentiment scoring, which can eliminate these blind spots, which do so easily creep in, even with the best of intent. And it feels like this is something which is not just about the pandemic, but so much wider, because inclusivity is so often in the eye of the beholder, so easy to have blind spots about what that means. And therefore more and more important to have these kind of tools which can measure where the blind spots might be. Of course, the other measurement we've heard about is data governance, and the work that we've heard about from Susan and Thomas, which gives a richer orbed understanding of data governance beyond the laws only, I think can be an important part of informing the fact that data governance is a journey, like becoming a leading inclusive digital economy is a journey as well. So Bhaskar, I'm confident that today I've heard ripening fruit that can indeed be plucked for a course that's in design at the moment. I've also heard some very taking outtakes, clips, which can definitely be part of informing the thinking around this next generation of private sector innovators in developing countries and policymakers, whom we hope will be the targets of this Fletcher Digital Frontiers course due out next year. So let me stop there and allow the discussion to continue.
Great, thank you, David. And you know that I always love food analogies. So, and this is right around lunchtime here on the East Coast. So now you got my mind on food. But I also want to thank you for actually really weaving a thread across the different pieces of insight that we've heard this, in the last hour and 15 minutes. Summarizing some of the key things that I think are themes that flow into each other, as we heard from Pratham and Dahlberg and George Washington and Equalception. I'm wondering whether those among our panelists have any observations as they listen to at least what you could pick up on regarding the findings and insights from the other teams. Do you have any questions? Do you have any observations based on the discussion so far? And I'll also invite the audience, I know that we're running very low on time, invite the audience to post a question or two as it strikes you. We'll come to you shortly, but let me give the panelists a chance to raise a question or offer any commentary. Yeah, all right, go ahead.
Yeah, Bhaskar, one of the points that really struck me in what Pratham was saying is the need for that combination of technology and human intervention, and the importance of understanding the context that you're addressing. So it's not just a question of finding the technological means of communication. You also have to understand the context of the recipients and how they're going to get hold of a phone, how they're going to be able to use the phone. So that was fascinating for me because it's played out for us as well in all of the countries that we were monitoring, this need to combine high-tech access to data with human interpretation. And secondly, that as you do it, trust is absolutely vital. And so Pratham had people calling every week to maintain that human connection, which built on the trust that they already had, that reservoir of trust, and continued to replenish it. And this is where we saw so many leaders go wrong. They built up a reservoir of trust at the beginning of the pandemic, but they didn't do anything to maintain it or restore it. And they had the tools to do that. They were just shall we say, digitally illiterate in this case, and they weren't employing the digital tools that they could have used to maintain that level of contact, except perhaps for Prime Minister Ardern in New Zealand, who really demonstrated how effectively you could use those tools.
Yeah, absolutely. Well said. Rukmini?
This is just a general comment from everything we hear, that at least in our case, or at least in our context, I'm a little bit worried, apart from the multiplier and divider angle that you brought up. I'm also a little bit worried about this technology as silver bullet for all problems versus this kind of need to really understand, learn, let's say technology as a silver bullet for all problems versus technology as a trigger for doing things that you were not able to do before. And I at least again, from my context, remain a bit concerned that those who are providing the technology are perhaps not investing enough in understanding the complexity of where it's landing. And so where will be the incentives to learn from this phase before it evaporates? Because as the world is coming back to some kind of whatever situation, we seem to be in a hurry to get back to opening schools, getting back to curriculum, getting the school buses out, and maybe losing this, I think a very fertile time that we've been through.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's very well said, Rukmini. And of course, we are looking at everything through the lens of technology, and it might create the impression that technology is this omniscient power that can help solve all our problems. And of course, we know that technology is just one tool in a larger toolbox, and it kind of needs to connect with other tools and other aspects of the context. But before we run out of time, I do want to take a few audience questions. So there's a question from a person. The name is Lok Darji, and he says I'm assuming it's a he. He says he's a former refugee and currently working at the IRC. His question is: since 2000, the refugee crisis increased by 41%, and there's increasing number of dictatorship around the world, and we've seen that even if it isn't dictatorship, according to Freedom House, autocracy and autocratic governance has just kind of gone up. Certainly has gone up over the last 2 years, and this is a threat to humans around the world. It's a threat to world democracy, and some of the attributes of the refugee crisis goes to some with those who have better access to technology and the ability to control technology. So the question that Lok has is, what's the future of what he calls the refugee issue and the vast majority of refugees who don't have access to technology to compete with economic as well as the techno-political forces that are harnessing technology in their favor? I know this is a big, loaded, complex question. I'm wondering if any of you have a perspective on it. Anyone? I think there is certainly an implication from the perspective of data governance and data ownership. There's a perspective from Oret's work in terms of harnessing emotions from the ground, and then basically being able to read patterns and see if people from the bottom up could make their voices heard. Robin, there could be a perspective from digital accelerators. To what extent do you harness the power of migrants and refugees who are, certainly have been affected by the imbalance in the way technology is being used? So let me open this question to the panel. Who would like to take it? Yeah, Oret, go ahead.
So, Bashka, we've done a similar project in Turkey, looking at the lived experience of Syrian refugees. And I really do think that there is potential here to give voice to people, because the Syrian refugees were working, but they didn't have permits to work, right? So they weren't in the camps. They were actually all out working in the Turkish economy, but they were invisible. And So we were able to use social media to capture their voices and play them back to Turkish government ministries like the economics ministry and the labor ministry, who needed, and even the trade unions, who needed to know that this huge community of several million people was actually working in their economy and to understand what their needs were. And one of the key things we saw was that in the conversations of these Syrian refugees, they were not talking about going to Germany. They were looking to settle in Turkey. Everything in their conversation was about, how do I find an apartment? How do I get a permit? How do I learn Turkish? How do I buy a car, etc.? So it was very important to understand the lived experience and the motivations, if you like, of those refugees. So you can use these technologies to understand situations if the policymakers are ready to do so.
Yeah, absolutely.
And maybe if I could,
Yeah, sorry, go ahead, Robin.
I was just going to briefly build on that and love the anchoring on hearing the voice, and just wanted to add a couple of things that I've seen from different angles. One is, in some of the work we started doing as COVID immediately hit, was using existing data to better recognize patterns in movement and mobility. And for one, looking at humanitarian organizations and emergency response in places like the ECOWAS community in West Africa and others, the ability to use existing data in a properly aggregated form, so as not to violate any individual protections, but to be able to see that when a crisis hits, or when COVID hits, or when hotspots erupt, what will naturally happen to populations, or even through the existing movements of people, where trade hubs, where there's movement and flow across borders and things. The ability to have that data at the fingertips of decision makers who are trying to support migrants in this space, or trying to preempt like when the next crisis will hit or what can happen, allows them to be more responsive. So I guess one aspect that I was optimistic about over the past 12 months in particular was seeing how more organizations were looking to what data exists and how they can build better information to be able to predict and prepare for it. And I think linking that to the voice question, the lived experience of what's happening, I think is a very powerful combination. I was just going to add one other piece, which is linked to the aspects of skills, which is a recognition that there was an interesting conversation hosted by the Danish Refugee Council a few weeks ago, where it was really looking at more and better investments in the connectivity, and a recognition that these communities have a very significant set of skills that already existed and often can be some of the most educated populations. And the perverse value of the COVID environment, where people are working more remotely, has led to a lot more reflecting on how do we aggregate and understand what skills exist and allow for space for people to work more effectively in different constructs remotely. But the skills and the value that people are adding to the communities they're in was starting to come to the surface. And maybe the last thing, sorry, as I'm speaking out loud, was a recognition of the power of identity systems and recognizing the movement across borders, and certainly a challenge for refugee communities of any sort, but the ability for even governments thinking about cross-border identity and harmonization of some of that data information can also be helpful as a response if used in the right way. So no perfect answers, but just a few ideas that sparked.
Thank you for that, Robin. And we missed a couple of your sentences, but I think we managed to close the gaps. Speaking of technology, working most of the time, but 10% of the time it doesn't work, and we have probably become a little bit better at closing the gaps here. We have another quick question, and then we'll do a wrap. What's that? Yeah, this is the one, right? So the question is, won't most innovative solutions actually arise organically from the private sector rather than by top-down government mandate? And the example that the person is thinking of is the emergence of Zoom at the outset of the pandemic. That's it. Who'd like to address this question? Zoom emerged long before the pandemic. It's been around for a while. So the technology that was waiting to scale up and be discovered and be harnessed. But I guess the question is, how much should we rely on top-down versus private sector-led technological innovations and distribution. Take that off. Perhaps I go to you, Robin, because you're thinking about digital accelerators, and certainly in the continent of Africa, this is the question: how much do we turn to government versus bottom-up innovation in using technology as at least a catalyst for acceleration?
Happy to share some thoughts. I was actually also virtually thinking of David. I know he spent a lot of time looking at the balance between innovation and regulation in the world. I think the private sector certainly brings to light some very customer consumer relevant innovations. I think leaving it just to the private sector, the reason it becomes a challenge is in part because the regulation doesn't always keep pace with what's possible. And so in my experience working with some very forward-leaning entrepreneurs across the continent, particularly in the digital finance space, but also within identity and the spaces we're speaking about, what I found is that the ideas that they're coming up with, the solutions they're seeing, quickly run up against a question of, well, how would you classify how this works and how it gets regulated? And if they're not a part of the conversation, what the risk ends up being is things don't happen, or they don't get to scale, they don't expand because of a perception of risk that may or may not be as substantial as realized. With a bit of forward leaning into the role that governments can play, the idea of regulation turns into space for innovation and flexibility. So on the one hand, I think the private sector will come up with many solutions. I think the partnership between government and private sector is what allows those ideas, application services and solutions to proliferate. And then second, I would curious to hear from the colleagues as well, but I see a space for government to be also a leader in innovating with the use of digital and technology as an anchor user of these solutions, but also as an entity that is holding some responsibility for creating a more conducive business environment. And so I see a strong role for government making the ease of business registration and business growth and figuring out how to curate innovation and have the right kind of policies in place. And in and of themselves, some of the solutions we've been talking about today are those that governments can be providing. So I see it as others may see it differently. I see it as having much more opportunity for impact and particularly inclusive growth when these two sectors are working hand in hand, than one leading or working in parallel. Would love to hear from my colleagues. I'm sure others have thoughts for there. I see Arturo smiling. And
thank you, Robin, for that. And I think we would love to hear from your colleagues. Unfortunately, we are also banging up against our 90-minute mark that we had reserved for this fascinating conversation, which deserves much more than 90 minutes, to say the least. I think this notion of hand in hand is a useful image to walk away from this discussion with. I started with this notion of this almost contradictory role of technology as a multiplier and a divider. We talked about the potential for technology to be an enabler of bottom-up creativity, bottom-up innovation. Say in the context of refugee and migrant populations, technology is a way to connect across different parts of the refugee community. It's a way for people to send remittances or get essential communications. But at the same time, the data that's being generated by such communications could potentially be used for surveillance purposes by autocratic governments. So it's both. It's a divider and it's a multiplier. And how do we continue to work? Whether it's a private sector or public sector or the social sector, to push the needle towards enablement and inclusion and multiplication. Last word for you, Arturo. Any takeaways as you reflect on this whirlwind of a discussion?
Yeah, no, many takeaways. Thank you. I mean, to all the panelists, amazing work and amazing presentations. I think I would just say we have been talking for so long about the importance of digital inclusion. Mastercard, we do financial inclusion as well. And it just feels to me that it was forced digital inclusion over the last 2 years, right? And it finally happened at, again, just looking at the numbers at rates that we had never imagined. And I take Rukmini's point about let's not let it evaporate on the one hand. Like, what are we going to do to make some of these gains sustained or stay at those levels? But at the same time, it's not a silver bullet, as she said. How do we reconnect it to kind of humanity and human processes? And I would hate to feel that it was just an anecdote that in 10 years we're going to say, oh, suddenly we had 30% more smartphones, but then we lost them the next year. And so I think the agenda for this council for IDEA 2030, for the research and for the work that you have ahead is it's quite interesting and quite exciting. So
thank you for the partnership, Arturo. And thank you for the partnership for all our IDEA 2030 council members, Rukmini, Willema, Susan, Thomas, Orette, Robin, and am I missing anybody? Well, Jordan Fabianski, who's also a partner from Dalberg, is not here, but thanks to him as well. We're collectively trying to understand the dual impact of the technological revolution and the forced revolution that the pandemic has dropped on us. And this notion of not letting the impact of that evaporate is certainly really important. And we are living through these revolutions as we speak, because we certainly have not seen the end of the tunnel here. We might be seeing a little bit of light, but we aren't back into the blazing sunlight. And when we come back in the blazing sunlight, the world will have changed. So the schools that Rukmini and Willema have been studying, those schools aren't the only arbiters of education anymore. You'll have the communities, the parents, the siblings are also going to become part of the education process. And how does technology fit into that larger picture is the question that in many ways is going to translate into the way we work, the way in which we entertain, the way in which we meet each other, and hopefully the way in which we teach each other. And David, we look to you for some insight in that. And Orette, thank you for giving us another tool to put in our toolbox as we try and understand how these interventions work. And Susan, thank you for helping us think about the role of data, which is certainly going to be an enormously important issue. And governments are just coming to grips with what they need to do, and they're all looking at each other, trying to figure out what the right answer to the data governance question is. So this is going to be a long journey. I also want to thank our colleagues who made this journey here at IDEA 2030 possible. I'm looking at Anu Heror, Chris Compton, Ali Schmidt-Fellner, Ravi Chaturvedi, Joy Zhang, and Christina Filipovich, who have been working tirelessly to get us to this point, and working with our research partners and with all the technologies that we still haven't mastered to get across to all of you. I also want to thank all our participants across the world who have joined, and we'll see you next time. Have a fantastic turn into the new year. Let's hope that 2022 is a better year than 2020, and hopefully a better year than 2021. Be well. Thank you.